This video is brought to you by Lilo. More about them later in the video. But if you're an educator and you're showing this to a group of students, you might want to skip the sponsored segment. Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by James CJ, so be sure to show him some love in the comments as you deploy your like, subscribe, and ring that bell if you haven't, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical figures. Let's get to it. The USSR existed from 1917 until its collapse in December 1991. During its existence, the USSR was led by a series of general secretaries, each with their own claim to fame or infamy. Mikhail Gorbachev was the last Soviet leader. His tenure in office started with promises to change the USSR for the better, to keep the system but modernize it, slightly democratize it, and allow it to re-establish itself as a superpower of the future. Instead, he accidentally became the reason it all started falling apart. His rise was long and slow, but once he got to power, it felt like things simply never slowed down. Gorbachev was the man who tried to save the Soviet Union, but in his efforts instead exposed it and made a stronger case against it than for it. This is how the last Soviet leader ushered in the USSR's demise. Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev was born on March 2, 1931 in the Soviet village of Privolnaya in the North Caucasus. I hope I pronounced that right. If not, I'm sorry. The Gorbachevs were an ethnically Russian family. Originally named Viktor, his mother and grandmother held a secret baptism and renamed him Mikhail, as her family was Christian and his father's side wasn't, as Christianity wasn't viewed fondly in the USSR. Mikhail's childhood was far from easy in the rural locality of Privolnaya. While Mikhail's relationship with his father, Sergei, was close, his relationship with his mother, Maria, was distant and cold. Gorbachevs were peasants, with Gorbachev stating, "We were poor, practically beggars." The first decade of Mikhail's life was spent in some of the worst years of the Stalin regime, from the famine in 1933 to World War II in 1939. Following the war, Mikhail proved an exemplary student and even won an award for harvesting grain in the form of the Order of the Red Banner of Labor. The order was awarded to people for excellent service to the Soviet Union. Gorbachev won a space at Moscow State University, or MSU, thanks to his award, glowing recommendations from his teachers, and a Soviet version of affirmative action, which favored students from the working class and those from rural backgrounds. Another aspect that helped Gorbachev's case was his newly accepted membership as a candidate member of the Communist Party. Mikhail was a staunch communist who understood the Marxist-Lenin version of pure communism. So in 1950, at the age of 19, the independently minded, self-confident, and slightly arrogant Mikhail Gorbachev left for Moscow to attend the most prestigious university in the nation and start his journey into Soviet politics. And now I want to talk to you all man to men. Men, did you know that strengthening your pelvic floor is just as important as, say, working out your abs for endurance and strength? Are you not quite sure what a pelvic floor is? Well, pelvic floor muscles are key to things like core strength, endurance, and get this, bladder control. If your pelvic muscles are weak, you could face challenges like reduced performance, incontinence, and blowing up all over the launch pad. And no, I'm not talking about a rocket launch. Or am I? If one or more of these problems sounds familiar, don't worry, because strengthening these muscles can also improve prostate health by promoting better circulation. And today's sponsor, Lilo, can help you. The Lilo F2S Stamina Trainer is a high-tech male stamina training device that strengthens your pelvic floor with guided exercises conveniently accessed with the Lilo app. Get real-time feedback to optimize your training and performance. Wink, wink. The Lilo app's Kegel exercise program, yes, you heard that correctly, apparently men can do Kegels too, you learn something new every day, right? Will help you strengthen your pelvic floor muscles, enhance control, and improve stamina, support your prostate health, and improve your performance under the covers by promoting better circulation to certain, shall we say, areas. If you're ready to level up your endurance and performance, go ahead and check out Lilo F2S now by heading to the link in the description and pinned comment, and start your pelvic fitness journey today. The next few decades of Mikhail Gorbachev's life and rise to power aren't always the most fascinating aspects of his story, but they did shape the leader he'd become. Starting in 1950, Gorbachev was introduced to a different world, a more metropolitan one, in the form of Moscow and MSU. He was not well received by the more elite student body. While other students would state Gorbachev was deeply provincial or had the look of a peasant, it was his academic prowess and knowledge that helped soften these attitudes over time. Come 1955, Mikhail was on the verge of graduating. His time at MSU shaped a man who believed himself to be an intellectual with a philosophical mind. Another valuable aspect of his time at MSU was meeting Raisa Titarenko, whom he married on September 25, 1953. Raisa would remain Mikhail's a loyal partner and his closest advisor for the remainder of his life. During Gorbachev's time in Moscow, he became the Komsomol leader of his entering class. The Komsomol, a Soviet political youth organization for Russians, was considered a political organ, used to spread communist teachings and prepare future Communist Party members. Eventually, Mikhail was elevated to full party membership in 1952 at age 21. After MSU in 1955, Mikhail and Raisa left Moscow for Stavropol, where he'd start his time in local politics. A few years later, on January 6, 1957, they welcomed their only child into the world, Irina Gorbachev. For Mikhail, a pivotal moment in his evolution as a politician came with the rise of Nikita Khrushchev, who embarked on a de-Stalinization campaign following Stalin's death. For the remainder of Khrushchev's time in power, he'd embarked on many efforts to aid the de-Stalinization campaign, marketing himself and Khrushchev as genuine Marxists or genuine Leninists, as opposed to the perverse version of communism that Stalin embodied. As the 1970s rolled around, Gorbachev had essentially secured his place in the upper echelons of the party. During his time heading the Stavropol region, he began seeing how inefficient centralized leadership from Moscow could be and how it could create hard-to-solve problems. During his tenure in Stavropol, Gorbachev focused on several key things. He focused on his relationships with other powerful Soviet politicians and the KGB. He focused on local issues, primarily the low agricultural production levels of the area, which led to projects like the expansion of irrigation systems, record grain harvesting, etc. These efforts paid off. He was viewed favorably locally and in the party. His time in Stavropol was essential in getting Mikhail Gorbachev closer to the beating heart of the Soviet Union, Moscow. In November 1978, Gorbachev emerged from the more localized political scene and was appointed as the Central Committee's Secretariat for Agriculture. It was in Moscow, in this new position, that he truly began advancing, becoming a full member of the Politburo in 1980. His lifestyle in this role changed tremendously. A nicer home and apartment in Moscow that he allowed his daughter and her husband to occupy, better healthcare, chefs, servants, secretaries, bodyguards, and more access to party elites were among the many benefits that came with the role. When Yuri Andropov became general secretary, Gorbachev was happy with the appointment. Andropov and Gorbachev had a mentor-mentee relationship, with Andropov telling Gorbachev to expand his policy areas and giving him more responsibility, clearly preparing him for the highest office in the USSR. Of course, when Andropov died, it was no secret that he wanted Mikhail to succeed him, but Gorbachev's young age, which would be an asset later, was a hindrance at the time. The job instead went to Konstantin Chernenko, a high-ranking member with a history of poor health. It was during these 4 years of ailing general secretaries that Gorbachev shined and proved himself as a leader, filling in where the USSR's current leadership often fell short. In many ways, he was general secretary before he even held the title. Then it all aligned as another leader fell, and Gorbachev's path to the highest position in power became the clearest it had ever been. When Konstantin Chernenko died of heart failure on March 10, 1985, Gorbachev officially ascended to the General Secretary. His ascension could have been a bitter battle between many contenders, but that wasn't how things ultimately panned out. Gorbachev himself believed that there were many people gunning for the position, most of an advanced age compared to his age of 53. But in the end, with a lot of work from himself and his allies, his nomination was met with little opposition, and the Politburo unanimously elected their new leader. It was obvious that one of Gorbachev's major appeals was his age, even though it had stifled his chances previously. The last 3 general secretaries were old and frail and had numerous health issues, with the last 2 leaders dying a little over a year into the job. job. It's unlikely that anybody in the Politburo or across the CPSU had even an inkling of the kind of leader Gorbachev would become. For them, he was young and healthy, and for now, that's what mattered. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to ultimate power in the USSR, things in the Soviet Union weren't in great shape. Under the leadership of Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet economy stagnated for nearly 2 decades. Then, following Brezhnev, there were 2 Soviet leaders over the course of 2.5 years. Their short tenures meant no meaningful change or improvement occurred. So domestically, the USSR was no longer stagnating, it was also faltering. In a world where the Cold War was a constant noose around the necks of the USSR and the US in particular, the numerous changes to leadership in such a short time made foreign policy extremely difficult. Something which US President Ronald Reagan noted when he said in an interview, "My delay in getting started in dealings with the Soviet Union, they kept dying on me." But with Gorbachev coming into power, a younger man in decent health, there was hope that things might be different. What helped was that both Reagan and Gorbachev had something important in common. They hated war, and they hated nuclear weapons even more. While overall the US was happy to see a Soviet leader who didn't appear on the verge of death, the US hoped he'd be someone they could work with. However, as was standard of the era, there was a level of skepticism believing that it was all an act to lull them into a false sense of security. In his acceptance speech after being unanimously elected General Secretary, Gorbachev mentioned words like democratization and glasnost, which means openness to public scrutiny, but maintained the ideals of the experiment that was the USSR, and even echoed standard Soviet rhetoric that could be found in the speeches of many that came before him. However, his approach to these ideals is where the difference lies, and the repercussions would be the unintentional unraveling of an empire. Almost immediately, the changes in leadership were felt. After 2 months in power, Gorbachev traveled to Leningrad and engaged with the people. It wasn't broadcast live on TV, but was recorded without Gorbachev's knowledge. When it spread amongst his inner circle, they wanted that speech to be broadcast across the USSR. Gorbachev was initially hesitant, but Raisa eventually convinced him to allow its broadcast. It spread like wildfire and excited people about their new leader. Gorbachev denounced the cult of personality that had plagued the USSR, having seen its corrosive elements when he was in the midst of helping to de-Stalinize the Soviet bloc. In his initial stages, Gorbachev worked on resetting as much as he could by pursuing various reforms without doing anything to endanger him politically. He promoted many of his supporters to ensure his political survival and culled the opposition. While not a unique approach, the difference was that while it took prior Soviet leaders roughly 5 years to achieve this, Gorbachev did it in a year. 3 words encapsulate Gorbachev's agenda: glasnost, perestroika, and uskorinya, which translate to transparency, restructuring, and acceleration respectively. Sorry if I screwed up any of those pronunciations. Russian is hard. One quote that sums up the ideology Gorbachev pursued was socialism with a human face. Glasnost opened communication and discussion both within the government and between the government and its people. Perestroika refers to the reforms Gorbachev hoped to achieve. Uskorinya doubled down and accelerated those efforts, specifically related to economic reforms. Glasnost reduced the Communist Party's power, introduced multi-candidate elections, allowed for freer media, and pertinent criticism of the government. It was met with mixed results. Some welcomed this change, however, party hardliners were alarmed by it, and many Soviet citizens were just uncomfortable and perhaps distrustful of it. This is not all that surprising when you consider that this had simply not been the way of life in the USSR for its entire existence, and criticizing the government in the past could have resulted in your death or imprisonment. When it comes to perestroika and uskorinya, there are several things to focus on. The first is alcohol consumption, which had increased dramatically from 1950 to 1985. Knowing the drain it was putting on productivity, Gorbachev went about trying to fix the issue. Alcohol sales were limited to those over 21, the sales times adjusted, the cost of purchase increased, at-home alcohol production was prohibited, and drinking at work was also prohibited. At first, it was working with a 40% decline in consumption, but the adverse effects were similar to prohibition in the US during the early 20th century. Underground production and consumption of alcohol cost the Soviet economy a loss of 100 billion USD between 1985 and 1990. He declared his efforts a failure in 1988. His efforts to increase production were where uskorinya was most focused. To attack the period of stagnation facing the USSR, Gorbachev made attempts to make things more efficient, make people more productive, increase investment in economy, crack down on corruption, and try to create competition. His efforts, like the alcohol measures, did not increase productivity. Additionally, injection of investment into the economy resulted in high inflation. Perestroika was the guiding principle, while Uskorinya was more targeted to the economy. Its failure overall can be attributed to a lack of clear goals, external factors, internal sabotage by some in the party, and market negligence. Oil prices decreased, which shrunk the already poor Soviet economy. Soviet debt was also high, and it increased in Gorbachev's efforts to implement economic reforms. Another major impediment was Gorbachev's short-sightedness, which allowed loopholes to be exploited with less oversight, resulting in more corruption and monopolization. The USSR was bleeding cash. Printing more to keep up with demand, industries were getting worse, consumer shortages became more frequent, the value of the ruble plummeted, and inflation continued to rise. Almost the entire time Gorbachev was in power, he faced a challenge that was too difficult to overcome. He either went too far or not far enough. There simply was no middle ground. The past, present, and future were fighting for a voice at the table, fighting about what they were fighting to preserve, or what they were fighting to change. While Gorbachev was a hard worker to a fault, he was also too grand and ambiguous in his own vision. Andrei Grashev, Gorbachev's advisor and spokesman, stated Gorbachev had an unwillingness, bordering on an aversion to spend too much time on routine, everyday, ongoing matters. He preferred matters of great moment, vast ideas, fateful decisions, and projects that transcended mundane horizons. Sounds a lot like he had ADHD, doesn't it? While ambition can be good, it can also be dangerous when it blinds you from your sense of reality and silences critical thinking. Gorbachev wasn't wrong about the state of the USSR and how long-standing shortcomings were coming to a head, resulting in a superpower that was clearly in decline, bogged down by inefficiency, corruption, stagnation, and discontent. But his efforts to fix things were just exposing bigger, more fatal flaws in a nearly 7-decade system. Beyond his domestic issues, foreign policy was no picnic either. While he did get along well with other world leaders, there was little trust among all parties despite the strong relationships he built with world leaders during his tenure. Some of Gorbachev's biggest foreign policy goals were rather simple: get out of Afghanistan, de-escalate tensions with the US, improve the relationship with China, and get the rest of Europe to separate itself from the US further. On almost all fronts, he didn't really succeed. He failed to get out of Afghanistan. Tensions between the US and USSR constantly fluctuated. Things did improve with China, but not dramatically, and Europe actually got closer to the US during this period. In order to identify all of these ideas and efforts Gorbachev made to rehabilitate and resuscitate the USSR, we had to ignore one of the most controversial moments in Soviet history, one that started the downfall: Chernobyl. Back in April of 1986, a little over a year in power, disaster struck in Pripyat, Ukraine. This isn't an obscure story and we don't have time to go in depth into it, but the bottom line was that a disaster occurred at a nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine. For a while, the extent of the disaster was underreported and downplayed by people close to the matter. Gorbachev was being fed a far less grim picture of what had happened, and it was only discovered because Swedish authorities noticed enhanced radiation levels and determined, based on wind direction, that something had happened in the USSR. This event did a few things. It showed Gorbachev that some of his worst fears about the Soviet Union were true. In the US and other Western nations, it did just about the same, but came with even worse fears about reckless use of nuclear technology. Would the Cold War end in nuclear fallout by accident and not on purpose? For the world, it reaffirmed fears about the Soviets' secrecy and the danger it posed. Considering it happened so early on in Gorbachev's tenure, it set a tone that carried on throughout his time in power. 1989 kicked off a fall of communism sweep across Soviet states after Gorbachev continued loosening the reins. This led to democratic momentum throughout Europe and had an impact on a few key places like Hungary, Romania, and Poland, which started showing more signs of desiring independence. Gorbachev was a bit bullish in his belief that these events wouldn't have damaging effects on the overall USSR or their abandonment of socialism. It was miscalculated. It was a crack in a wall already at its breaking point. Speaking of walls, the next issue was the fall of the Berlin Wall in October 1989, which accidentally reintroduced freedom of movement between East and West Germany and ended the Soviet occupation of East Germany 4 decades after World War II. At home, accusations against Gorbachev were flying left, right, and center. Many accused him of capitulating to Western appeals out of weakness in an attempt to gain their approval, while also reducing the USSR to ruin and anarchy. On March 14, 1990, Gorbachev was elected to be the President of the Soviet Union, a title he held at the same time as General Secretary, but gave him a 5-year term limit, which was created to ensure Gorbachev didn't have the threat of removal hanging around him. It was a somewhat desperate move, but it was too late. As the 90s approached the lackluster results of Gorbachev's reforms, the tension across the Soviet states, and the issues at home, in particular in Politburo, were becoming insurmountable. There had been warning signs of what was potentially coming for Gorbachev for almost a year. His more trusted inner circle had been asking for Gorbachev to be more proactive and declare a state of emergency, but he'd refused. It was August 1991. Mikhail and Raisa were in Crimea on holiday and would return on August 20th to sign the new Union Treaty, which was to redefine the Soviet Union, allowing for more state autonomy while remaining in the Union. On August 17th, a group of men who became known as the Gang of Eight, with Vice President Gennady Yanayev as a member, met at a KGB guest house in Moscow, where they denounced the treaty. They felt it would be the USSR's undoing, so they decided to take matters into their own hands. On August 18th, they flew to Crimea and detained Gorbachev in his dacha. They took control of the USSR and claimed Gorbachev was ill, which was, of course, a lie. The events of the coup were spread over 3 days, and since he was detained in Crimea, Gorbachev's story of the event is almost unimportant. It's more Yeltsin's story, as this was his true rise to power. The coup, while brief, had dire ramifications. By the end of the year, communism, the USSR, and Gorbachev's career were all dead and buried, with Gorbachev fully resigning by December 25th. The collapse of the USSR would have likely happened eventually, but Gorbachev's efforts to reform a broken system exposed it for what it was: a broken system. Life after power was not easy for Gorbachev in a country that didn't like him and a world that didn't need him. Initially, he worked on his foundation, which he founded in December 1991, which focused on presenting ideas for a democratic Russia and its future. He lectured around the world and made good money doing so, wrote a book, and even did some strange ads for companies that had just set up shop in Russia, like Pizza Hut. After initially vowing not to criticize Yeltsin's presidency, he eventually lambasted the president over reforms that led to inflation and widespread poverty. This led him to doing something nobody believed he should do: run for president. He announced his candidacy on March 1st, 1996. Running as an independent, Gorbachev faced challenges like a lack of media coverage surrounding the campaign and a general public hatred for Gorbachev. Winning was never going to happen, and in a way, he knew that. It's unclear if his intentions were focused on rehabilitating his image or if he truly believed in his campaign. Regardless, his bid failed. In total, Gorbachev received 0.5% of the total vote in round 1 and came 7th out of 11 candidates, with Yeltsin ultimately winning. In July 1999, tragedy struck Gorbachev when his wife, Raisa, was diagnosed with leukemia. She was treated in Germany, but fell into a coma in September, dying shortly after. Mikhail vowed never to marry again, a promise he kept. In December 1999, Yeltsin resigned from the presidency, and Vladimir Putin took over before being officially elected president in May 2000. In a way, Gorbachev and Putin shared many similar beliefs. Gorbachev was critical of US attitudes to the end of the Cold War, especially their talking points of winning a war without winners. He was critical of their attitude towards Putin. He was anti-NATO expansion and activities, especially the Iraq War. Starting in 2008, Gorbachev slowly became more critical of Putin, which only increased year by year. Gorbachev lived to see the start of the Ukraine war, but opted to remain relatively quiet on the subject. His foundation relayed that they affirmed the need for an early cessation of hostilities and immediate start of peace negotiations. There is nothing more precious in the world than human lives. Additionally, Mikhail's interpreter stated that Gorbachev was traumatized by the invasion in the months leading up to his death. On August 30th, 2022, Mikhail Gorbachev died at the age of 91 in Moscow due to a severe prolonged illness. The last decade of his life, in particular, was spent in and out of the hospital, undergoing numerous surgeries, some minor and some more complex. Perhaps the most telling of Gorbachev's legacy is how differently everyone interprets it. Westerners have a false belief that Gorbachev was liberal, but that wasn't true. He had no desire to see the USSR fall, he just wanted to reform it, improve it, but ultimately keep it intact. By all accounts, the fall of the Soviet Union was an accident. Look to Gorbachev's response to separatists in Latvia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Lithuania as proof. It was chaos and bloodshed, which could have gone further if not for the threat of nuclear fallout and civil war. Despite his humiliating end as a leader, he continued collecting numerous awards around the world, including the Nobel Peace Prize, which he was conflicted about receiving. At home, he was far from loved both in Russia and across the former Soviet states. One of the people who hated him the most was and remains Putin. He blames Gorbachev for the USSR's collapse. Yeltsin may have made it official with the 1991 Belarus Accords, but to Putin, it was Gorbachev who shouldered the blame. While his legacy is different depending on who you ask and how you feel, its shadow remains as Putin attempts to rebuild the world Gorbachev destroyed. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment a historical figure you think we should cover next, subscribe and ring that bell if you haven't, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical figures. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time.